Let's return to the UN Security Council in New York. The Minister for Foreign Affairs from Russia, Sergei Lavrov, speaking.
I think this is very timely because this is precisely this term, impunity, reflects what has been going on in that country since 2014. The national radical forces, open Russophobes and neo-Nazis came to power then as a result of an armed coup with direct support of Western countries. And right after that, they took the path of lawlessness and totally ignoring main rights and freedoms, the right to life, right of expression, right of access to information, right of conscience, the right to use your native language. And to date, the crimes on the Maidan in February 2014 remain unpunished. Those who perpetrated the horrific tragedy in Odessa on the 2nd of May of 2014 have not been found or punished. At the time, at the House of Labor Unions, dozens were burned alive and died. In the same categories of political murders of Olesya Buzyn, Pavlo Shermit, and other public figures and journalists. In spite of that, there's an attempt today to impose on us a completely different narrative about Russian aggression as the origin of all tragedy. This ignores the fact that for over 8 years, the Ukrainian army and fighters from the nationalist formations killed and continue to kill inhabitants of Donbas with impunity simply because they refused to recognize the result of the coup d'etat in Kyiv. They decided to uphold their rights, which were guaranteed by the Ukrainian constitution, including the right to freely use Russian, their mother tongue. Just recall how in 2015, the then Prime Minister, Mr. Yatsenyuk, declared that in Donbas, non-humans live in Donbas, inhumans. And the current president, Mr. Zelensky, did not go very far from that, who in an interview last September, when he was asked what he thought about the people who live in Donbas, he said, well, you know, there are people and sometimes there are species, they're beings. This seems to be a very common reference of the Ukrainian authorities. They declared all those who don't agree there as terrorists, and for 8 years the Kyiv regime has been conducting a military operation against the peaceful civilians. And by the way, in Ukraine for many years now, total mobilization of all adult population, including women, is being conducted in order to recruit them into the ranks of nationalist battalions and the armed forces. Now, by cynically declaring its commitment to the Minsk agreements, the Kyiv's authorities overtly sabotaged their implementation. There was financial transport blockade of Donbas. People were denied their pensions, their subsidies, their access to education. They were denied their basic civil rights, including those that were guaranteed by the international pacts of 1966. So then Mr. Zelensky, having been tired of pretending, stated that it was impossible to implement the Minsk agreement. In fact, Mr. Poroshenko, just a couple months ago, proudly stated that the Minsk agreements, which he signed, neither him nor no one else in the Ukraine had any intention of implementing these, that these agreements were simply needed to win time in order to obtain weapons from the West for the war against Russia. And the Secretary of the National Security and Defense Council, Mr. Danilov, said something very similar. Of course, the Kyiv regime owes its impunity to its Western sponsors, first of all Germany and France, but also the United States. Instead of pushing the Kyiv authorities to implement the Minsk agreement, Berlin and Paris and Washington cynically ignored the growing threats of Kyiv to resolve the problem of Donbas by force, the so-called Plan B. Over the past few years, the Kyiv regime has conducted a frontal assault on the Russian language. It brazenly trampled on the rights of Russian and Russian-speaking people people in Ukraine. Scandalous language laws were enacted on education in 2016, on ensuring the role of Ukrainian language as a state language in 2019, on the comprehensive general secondary education in 2020, on native peoples of Ukraine in 2021. All these laws are aimed at ousting the Russian language. In essence, it's complete ban. At the same time, laws were adopted that promoted the theory and practice of Nazism. The timid recommendations of the Venetian Commission of the Council of Europe and the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, the OSCE High Commissioner on Minorities, on amending the language legislation were simply ignored by Kyiv. And these multilateral structures at the same time didn't find the courage, or they were not allowed, to convince the Kyiv authorities to fulfill their obligations they undertook in the area of human rights. The Ministry of Education of Ukraine has excluded Russian literature from the school curriculum. Books are being destroyed, just as in Nazi Germany. And ethnic Russians are being subject to intolerance. And today, the officials from Ukraine have no longer even tried to hide their anti-Russian feelings, calling on the killing of Russians. Just a few examples. Mr. Vrublevsky, the Ukrainian ambassador to Kazakhstan, who's now in Kyiv, just a month ago declared in an interview, and I quote, "We're trying to kill Russians, as many Russians as possible. The more we kill today, the fewer our children will need to kill." End of quote. Did anyone notice this quote? Just earlier this April, the mayor of Dnipro, Filatov, said something similar. The time of cold-blooded fury has come. Now we have full moral right to calmly and with a clear mind to kill these non-humans around the world for as long as possible and as many as possible. End of quote. On the 13th of September of this year, just recently, Mr. Danilov stated, and I quote, "In towns where the Ukrainian armed forces enter, people will undergo Ukrainization without taking into account their views. This will apply not only to Russians, but representatives of other nationalities. And if you want to study any other language, such as Romanian, Polish, Ivrit, please go ahead, but not to be financed by our state. You can do it at your own expense. You can improve your educational level at your own expense." End of quote. Is there any need to say that all these Russophobic statements have remained unpunished? And we're not even talking about Russophobia here. This individual spoke about representatives of other ethnic groups that live in Ukraine. And of course, the ultimate was the interview with Mr. Zelensky on the 5th of August, who suggested to everyone who feels that they're Russian for the good of their children and grandchildren to get the hell out and to go to Russia. And I think the decisions that have been adopted by a whole range of regions of Ukraine about conducting referendums are the result of his advice. And under the guise of combating Russian aggression and separatism, Ukraine is strengthening its persecution of dissidents. In March, a ban on the activity of 11 political parties under the pretext of their links to Russia. Opposition Russian language television channels have been closed for any attempt to provide an alternative view to the official view. Journalists are persecuted. Madame Berezhnaya, a well-known public official who has often spoken at the UN and the OBSE, is in the prison of the security services. We have no doubt that Ukraine has become a completely totalitarian Nazi-like state where the norms of international humanitarian law are trampled on. There's no surprise that the armed forces and the national battalions are using the tactic of terrorists, using peaceful civilians as human And here, what's particularly cynical is the position of states that are pumping Ukraine full of weapons and training their soldiers. The goal is obvious. They're clearly stating it, to drag out the fighting as long as possible, in spite of the victims and destruction, in order to wear down and weaken Russia. That policy means the direct involvement of the West in the conflict and makes them a party to the conflict. The intentional fomenting of this conflict by the collective West remains unpunished. Of course, you won't punish yourselves, sir. We have no illusions that today the armed forces of Russia and the militias of Lugansk and Donetsk are being opposed not only by the neo-Nazi formations of the Kyiv regime, but the military machine of the collective West. And in real time, the regime of real time, using modern systems of weapons, ships, satellites, drones, NATO is providing into the Ukrainian armed forces and stating that, convincing them that Russia should be defeated on the field of battle. The official representatives of the European Union have stated this, and Russia should be punished by having any sovereignty stripped from it. This isn't even latent racism, but overt racism. Against the backdrop of mass shelling of towns and cities of Donbass, Mr. Zelensky is overjoyed at the effectiveness of Western weapons. Here's a quote: "At last we feel how powerfully Western artillery has begun to operate. The weapons that we've received from our Western partners, its accuracy is exactly what we need," he cynically stated. At the same time, there were no military or strategic targets located in the towns that were shelled. Only peaceful citizens of Donbass are suffering. Since the end of July, the armed forces are lobbing mortar rounds to the center of Donetsk and its environs that are banned. They're lobbing banned anti-personnel rounds called lobe or blade. This violates a convention in 1997 on the ban on anti-personnel mines, ratified by Ukraine, as well as the second protocol of the Geneva Convention on Conventional Weapons. Such outrages remain unpunished because the United States and their allies, with the connivance of international human rights institutes, have been covering up the crimes of the Kyiv regime based on the policy of Zelensky might be a bastard, but he's our bastard. The inconvenient truth that darkens the image of Ukraine as the victim of Russian aggression is carefully hushed up and sometimes deleted. Even Western human rights organization Amnesty International, which is difficult to accuse of sympathies to Russia, has been severely criticized and called an agent of the Kremlin, simply because in its report it's confirmed facts about the fact that Kyiv places heavy weapons at civilian facilities. Also, the criminal shelling of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant remain unpunished, even though from the 1st of September, representatives of the IAEA have been present there, and it's not very difficult to establish who's guilty for the shelling. And I just want to recall that the visit of the IAEA mission to this power plant was artificially delayed, even though already on the 3rd of June, all details were agreed, and the mission could have gone to the power plant already. And then it was a very unpleasant situation where the DESA, Department of Security of the UN, refused to give authorization to the specific itinerary, and then this was not a very honest actions. It simply delayed the visit to the Zaporozhye power plant by 2 months, even by 3 months. Practically 3 months. We're very also concerned about the fate of Russian soldiers who were taken prisoners. There are very many examples of torture, including violation of international humanitarian law. I'm sure that all those who are interested in what actually happened saw a video of the torture, atrocities by Ukrainian neo-Nazis against Russian soldiers who were thrown to the ground with their hands tied and were shot in the head. Did anyone here comment on this the crime at all? We have many witnesses of these criminal activities by the Kyiv regime that have been happening since 2014. Russian law enforcement bodies cooperating with their colleagues from Donetsk and Luhansk republics are investigating these thoroughly. Over 220 individuals have been found to be complicit, including the high command of the Ukrainian armed forces, commanders of units who shelled the civilian population. Also, there were cases against mercenaries from citizens of UK, Canada, United States, Netherlands, etc. I can assure you that all perpetrators, independently of their nationality, will be held accountable. I also want to draw your attention to the following. When Russian and Ukrainian negotiators at the end of March practically reached an agreement on the parameters of an agreement proposed by Kyiv. Just a couple of days later, the tragedy in Bucha occurred. The fact that it was staged leaves no doubt in anyone's mind. And I want to draw your attention, colleagues, that Western colleagues, right after that staged event, immediately cried outrage and introduced a new package of sanctions, spuriously accusing us of killing innocent civilians. Since then, when that propaganda operation was conducted, no one has mentioned Bucha other than us. And once again, in the presence of the Secretary General and the ministers, I would address you. Say, please demand the Ukrainian authorities to make a simple step, take a simple step to publish information about those individuals whose bodies were shown in Bucha. I've been asking this for the past month. Secretary General, please use your authority for this. It would be very useful to get to the bottom of this episode. And of course, we also noticed the increased activity of international justice with regard to Ukraine. There's supposedly efforts to investigate crimes committed in Ukraine that are ascribed to Russian authorities. All this is simply a very propaganda operation. I just want to recall that neither the coup d'etat in 2014 or the tragedy in Odessa or the shelling of Donetsk or any other crimes have led to any reaction from the International Criminal Court. And by the way, this International Criminal Court, there were some 3,000 references sent to the International Criminal Court against crimes committed against the inhabitants of ICC. There has been no reaction. And it seems that the ICC has now received instructions to step up its activity. We have no confidence in the work of this body. For the past 8 months, we were waiting for steps to be taken against impunity in Ukraine, and we don't expect anything more from this institution or a whole range of other international institutions. Everything I've said today simply confirms that the decision to conduct the special military operation was inevitable. We have said this more than once. We have provided a huge number of facts which show how Ukraine prepared to play the role of anti-Russia as a staging ground to create a threat against Russian security. And I can assure you that we will never accept this. Thank you very much.